Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Peat, and I have the great pleasure of being director of the David Hume Institute. This is the third, we're halfway, this is the third of our 5 politicians and the professionals talks. And I'm delighted this week to welcome Patrick Harvie, who is the co-convener of the Green Party in Scotland. Patrick has actually spoken for the David Hume Institute before. He wrote a paper for us in our, what was it called, The World in 2050, as I seem to remember, where we asked people to envisage what happens, and particularly to think about the global warming and the like. We got a lot of publicity from that by a very nice lady from St Andrews University who did photographic encapsulations of the new course being totally flooded, and the old course being totally flooded. And that got I think that hit every national newspaper. But we had a very good evening that time. Well, Patrick has served as regional MSP for Glasgow since 2003. He's a member of the Referendum Scotland Bill Committee and speaks for the Greens on finance and sustainable growth, justice and health. He previously worked in sexual health at what is now known as THT Scotland, I believe, and had stints at a community recycling charity, a phone line for teenagers, and he admits in his CV the Inland Revenue. In addition, he is a keen cook, an occasional runner, and a fan, I like this, of real ale, science fiction, and long train journeys. That sounds a good set for a good life. And as I know from the last time he was here, he's an excellent and engaging speaker. So I really look forward to this talk. Again, we've got friends from the Young Academy of Scotland with us, and again, we have the support of the 4 professional organisations, and I'm very grateful to them. But now, with no further delay, I now ask Patrick Harvie to speak to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you. Yes, I remember that little essay about Scotland in 2050. Did we reach the climate change targets? And if so, how? Never mind golf courses. I think I suggested that half of the United States had flooded, and the exodus from the Louisiana area was creating a wave of climate migrants who were hugely enriching the culinary culture of Glasgow and the west of Scotland at that point. So thank you. I'm very glad for the invitation to come and speak. And given that one of the questions you've asked us to think about is about a balanced response to the opportunities as well as the risks of independence, I'm quite intrigued that I'm at the halfway point. You've had 2 speakers, you've got 2 to come. The Greens, I would want to suggest, are probably in a more comfortable place to address ourselves to that balance of risks and opportunities that come from independence, because unlike our colleagues in the SNP, as a political party, we're not defined by our position on the Constitution. We're defined by a very different agenda. A different set of issues and challenges bring us together as a political party and as a movement. And I think the fact that we've been comfortable as a party reaching our position on the referendum question, on how to campaign and for what outcome, while acknowledging that we've got a diversity of views amongst our members, and certainly there's a diversity of views amongst our voters. There are Greens who will be voting yes, there'll be Greens who are voting no. There are many Greens who are yet to make up their mind and who are listening to the arguments. And I think the way to reach people who are yet to make up their minds is not to pretend that independence would be utopia or disaster. The truth is somewhere in between. I think we need to acknowledge that there are risks as well as opportunities. And I think if we can be honest about that, if both sides can be honest about that balance, then perhaps we've got an opportunity to meet undecided voters on their own ground, on their own terms. But before I come on to some of that, I suppose I need to start with what are those defining issues that form the Green Party. Why is there a Green Party? Why are there Green parties around the world? Because if we're thinking about what Scotland could achieve as an independent country or as a devolved country, if we're thinking about what economic recovery means, I need to reinforce that Greens approach those debates from fundamentally different premises than the other political parties that you've been hearing from. First of all, an acknowledgement of what has been wrong with our economy, with our society. What's been wrong and what has led to not just one economic crisis, but multiple crises, social, economic, and ecological, is a way of living human lives on this planet which is fundamentally unsustainable. It was a broken system before the financial crisis, before the economic recession. And even talking about a recession presupposes what is a very narrow way of understanding the health of an economy. Economic recession is defined in terms of GDP. Recovery is being defined now in terms of GDP. We're being told that we're beginning an economic recovery. We're not. We're not. What we're beginning is a new phase of the same problem. Economic recovery being measured in terms of GDP is simply trying to understand the response to recovery as let's get back to business as usual. We need to abandon business as usual. We need to abandon the economic systems and processes which have brought about these multiple social, economic, and ecological crises. If we measure the health of our economy in such narrow terms as how much money is swirling around, the value of transactions, and that's all GDP tells us about, then we can see, as we did in the decades before the crash, before the current recession, that you can have a long, protracted period of economic growth with widening inequality, with the benefits, the economic proceeds of that growth benefiting fundamentally those who need it the least and failing to benefit the wider world, failing to benefit people or the ecological systems that we depend on. And as a result, what we've seen is not only the driving of the most famous aspect, the most high-profile aspect of our ecological crisis, climate change. Climate change, we've known about the basic mechanism for, 150 years, a bit more than that. We've known that human activity is likely to be driving the process of climate change for certainly decades, perhaps half a century. And we've known about the scale of that problem. We've known how catastrophic it could be if we don't arrest that problem, if we don't change direction. We've known that certainly for a good number of years, probably for decades at a scientific level. And we've known about the lack of a coherent political response globally as well as in individual countries for decades as well. And yet, the more we know about this problem, the more clear the science becomes, the more echoingly empty is the political response at a global level. We see debates happening, for example, about Scotland's reliance on oil. How economically dependent would Scotland be on the oil and gas sector? How much of a problem would that be if we were to become independent, to have this single industry who's reliant on a price of a commodity which is volatile? How much of a problem would that be? I think it's worse. I think it's a bigger problem than many on the no side would suggest, because the valuation of that industry is based on total reserves. The oil and gas industry, its valuation is based on the reserves of fossil fuels that we have available to us. And we can't afford to burn them. The world already had, never mind unconventional gas, never mind new deep water drilling, known existing reserves of fossil fuels. We have many times more than we can afford to burn if we're remotely serious about preserving a climate which is habitable. A climate which is habitable, never mind a climate in which our economy can thrive, in which human well-being can flourish. So if the oil and gas industry is valued on the basis of reserves which we cannot afford to turn into economic value, then over-reliance on that industry is profoundly misguided. Part of the reason I support independence is not because I see, as Fergus Ewing gets the fire in his eyes when he talks about another 40 or 50 years of oil and gas extraction. It's not because I see the opportunity to continue that reliance. It's because I see the urgency of moving away from it. And because I see the power of independence as an opportunity to accelerate that transition away. Not just to talk about renewables as a great new industry for Scotland, but to talk about the transition towards renewables as a transition of ownership as well as a transition of energy. There are publicly owned energy companies investing in renewables right now in Scotland, but not ours. Why not? We could begin to develop a publicly owned energy company which needn't chase out private investment, which needn't be a wholesale nationalisation, but a publicly owned energy industry which would be able to put some of the profits from renewable energy, at least some share of this, back into the common good, and replace the revenue which we are not going to be able to rely on from fossil fuels. Now, you could begin this right now. Devolution, a devolved government with a political will, could begin it at a local level, investing in micro-renewables, investing in community heating systems, investing in some degree of onshore wind, some degree of solar and combined heat and power, different technologies in different places. But I think you could only really complete the job. You could only really start to begin to build an industry that could invest, that can use public sector borrowing powers to invest in renewable kit that will generate a profit in the future if we're independent, if we're able to make those borrowing decisions. That comes up against a problem with the SNP's prescription for independence, with what I would call quite a limited vision of independence which the White Paper sets out, which would inevitably lead to compromise and concession about questions like how much can we borrow, how much can we invest, even about the level and the source of taxation. And so, whether it might take a slightly longer transition or not, I do think we need to be looking at the independence of macroeconomic choices, and that means a different prescription than the SNP are offering on currency. It's not only, though, the climate change and energy aspects which I want to flag up in terms of the ecological crisis, because climate change, for all that humanity is still failing to offer an adequate response, climate change is only one of the planetary boundaries which we're already crossing or in danger of crossing. One comparison for this notion of planetary boundaries is the Plimsoll line. The unregulated free market shipping industry used to be a mass killer. Businesses, and indeed governments which relied on shipping, and an island like the UK had a heavy reliance on shipping, were willing to consign large numbers of merchant seamen to their deaths. That was simply an overhead. And it was seen as almost inconceivable that you would introduce a Plimsoll line, a boundary that the industry would not be allowed to cross. That it wasn't acceptable simply to say you're profitable. It was also necessary to say you're not going to cross this boundary, you're not going to put these lives at risk. And the industry and many politicians fought against the introduction of that boundary, that Plimsoll line, below which you cannot overload your ships. And yet, has it resulted in the crashing of world trade? Did it result? Of course not. It resulted in a more ethical, more successful industry because people were not afraid to work in it. Now, the planet is in a similar condition to an overloaded ship right now. And we need to start introducing Plimsoll lines. We need to start introducing planetary boundaries beyond which we will not allow our economy to overload the planetary system. Now, climate change is only one of these. The level of biodiversity loss is already more rapid than at any previous example of a mass extinction event that we know of from the geological and biological record. We're killing our fellow species at a faster rate than any phenomenon has done that we're aware of in the past. We're losing the ability to feed ourselves. At the same time as humanity is heading towards a population level of 9 billion, and I don't think population level in isolation is the sole issue, but a population of 9 billion, increasing proportions of which want to eat like you and I do, want to eat large amounts, waste large amounts, and have a higher proportion of meat and dairy in our diets. At the same time as we're doing that, we're destroying the basic resource that we need to grow the food that the planet needs. This is not something that industrial scale solutions like genetic engineering are going to be able to solve. This is not something that intensive farming is going to be able to solve, because intensive farming has been part of the problem all along. If we want to be able to feed ourselves, we need to look at the natural systems that the planet gives us and how we can nurture those systems, how we can stop abusing them, stop degrading them. And at this point, I'm going to whip out the knife that I threatened Jeremy with earlier and give a wee demonstration, because I've got an apple here. And I want you to imagine this apple as the planet. Now, what I'm going to show you is a little bit symbolic. I'm not going to pretend that the proportions are precise. And if anybody wants a bit of apple out of this, you'll be able to get one. But I'm going to take this apple and imagine that this is the planet. Let's think about how much of this planet is available for us to grow food on, to feed ourselves, to feed our species. And remembering as well that if we're increasing the amount of meat and dairy in our diet, that means increasing dramatically the basic foodstuffs that are grown, because we're feeding animals to turn that into very inefficient protein. How much of this is available for us to grow food and feed ourselves? Well, first of all, you have to take off not a sharp enough knife. First of all, you've got to take off that much, because that's the ocean. And we're only left with 1/4 left. And now, half of what's here is simply not habitable. It's space, a lot of it in the polar regions, which is not suitable for human habitation. So we've got a fairly small amount left over. And from that, we need to cut this in 4.
Careful, our insurance is
Tiny little pieces, because a great deal of that habitable area is not arable. It's not suitable for growing food. It's too hot, it's too cold, it's too rocky, it's too dry, it's too wet, it's too steep, or it's already been turned over for urbanization. It's not available for agriculture. So this tiny proportion, and actually, it's not even this slice. It's this tiny, tiny little layer of topsoil. This tiny, tiny little layer of topsoil, which is being degraded something like 30 or 40 times faster than it is being replenished. Topsoil takes a long time for the planet to replenish it. It's very, very fast for us to degrade it. And about half of it is what industrial farming has already destroyed in terms of its productive capability since the Second World War. That's what we've got left, and by some estimates there's only 40 or 50 years worth of it left at the current rate of soil degradation. Anybody want a bit of the ocean? No? Come up and have a piece later. I don't want it to go to waste. That's part of the problem. The question that many in industrial agriculture ask ourselves is, well, how could organic farming ever feed the planet? No. The question we should be asking is, how can industrial farming, how can intensive farming ever feed the planet when it is destroying the productive capacity that we depend on for the future? So food, energy. I could make a similar speech in relation to land, water, many aspects of the things which our economy depends on. And this notion that we can have an economy which is not fundamentally dependent on the ecological systems of our planet is a nonsense. The economy is not some abstract construct that clever human beings have come up with and can simply turn into a self-fulfilling system. It is absolutely, fundamentally dependent on ecological systems, on the planet around us, and on the damage that we are doing to it. Now, many of these systems we're handing over to what I would call the tyranny of big. The tyranny of big. large-scale monopoly control or near monopoly control, certainly monolithic control of our food system. I mean, it's not just a middle-class aspiration that we can maybe go to a farmer's market or an independent shop. It used to be the norm that our food system was in the hands of small businesses, of a proliferation, a vast number of small businesses instead of a small number of vast businesses. Now, we've got 4 or 5 mega retailers who absolutely control 80–90% of our food chain, not just at the retail end, but because of the power they exercise in the market, they control the production end as well. Now, what are the opportunities that we could have for a more vibrant high street, more diversity, more real choice instead of just choice between 5 or 6 different brands of packaged processed food, which ultimately are dependent on the same complex supply chain that gave rise to the meat crisis last year? The diversity that could offer real choice. This is not a fantasy. This is not something that's unachievable. This was the norm for the vast majority of human history, that our food chain was in diverse control. This aberration of monopoly control or near monopoly control has been a very recent development, and I believe it's been an unhealthy one. I talked about energy, and the idea of adding one publicly owned renewable energy company into the mix would not be the end of the story. I'd like to see not just the transfer of some proportion of our energy system into the public sector, but for what a colleague of mine in the Green Party of England and Wales likes to subvert a Thatcherite phrase. Thatcher talked about the property-owning democracy. My colleague in the Green Party down south likes to talk about the energy-generating democracy, the idea that any household or that any business or that any noted institution in Edinburgh's George Street would run a building without generating at least some of its energy from that building. The idea that any community would not think that it has a responsibility to look at its energy needs in terms of demand reduction as well as generation. An energy-generating democracy where we're not fully dependent on a handful of big entities, whether they're private sector or public sector. We talk about banking as well, the huge control that the banking industry, the financial services sector has on how the whole rest of the economy functions. And after a fundamental crisis, not just a crisis in reality, but a loss of trust as well, what have we seen? Have we seen fundamental change? We've seen a bit of tinkering around the edges, to be sure, and we've seen the UK government want to introduce one more mega bank into the mix, a few changes of regulation. Looking at some other countries, including some Northern European countries that my SNP colleagues like to compare us to, you look at a very different model, not one that's dominated by a handful of mega banks, but one where there's a rich diversity of co-ops, mutuals, municipal banks, local banks. Banks also with duty, an inherent, built-in, hardwired function, which is about investing in the real economy. Now, given that we already own a substantial part of our financial services sector now, not necessarily by choice, but because of necessity, the opportunity should have been taken to fundamentally change the way it works, to result in a process where the UK, or perhaps Scotland could do this separately, enjoys that rich diversity and an ecosystem of financial services rather than a handful of huge dominant players. A handful of huge dominant players, that's part of the problem. Because when they become, the phrase that was used, too big to fail, it's a nonsense. They become too big to fail. It means they become so big that they can blame us for their failure. They can force the rest of us, the rest of society, to pay for their failure. They do still fail, but they need us to bail them out. So banking, retail, food, energy, we've got this tyranny of big. And I think it applies to the way we talk about the economy as well. It applies to the way that many politicians talk about the future of Scotland. the idea of everlasting growth on a planet of finite resources, the idea of punching above our weight. I don't want to punch above our weight. I want our people to have a decent life. And I think that's not necessarily achieved by the ongoing pursuit of everlasting growth, which cannot be achieved forever within a planet of finite resources, and the pursuit of which ultimately distracts us from the need to look at human well-being. There's another theme that I wanted to develop before we go into questions, and that's in response to something that Douglas Alexander was arguing at the weekend. He argued, and particularly because we've got the Young Academy here, I wanted to address this. He was arguing that this is the networked generation, and that because in the 21st century, young people are growing up with an absolute understanding that we are part of an interconnected world, that we have to connect, can connect more effectively, more efficiently, faster with people around the world. Because of that, there must be a fear of isolation, that independence is about throwing up barriers, that it's about retreating from the world. And he argued that this networked generation, this 21st century digital age, the challenges and opportunities that that creates for us is a reason to vote no. I want to challenge that fundamentally. I think the opportunity to take responsibility for our own lives, the opportunity to decide for ourselves what kind of economy we wish to live in, what kind of society we wish to build, what wealth even means in our lives. Is it just about having more money? Is it just about, oh, that's that shallow, simplistic £500 richer, £500 poorer argument, as though distribution doesn't matter, as though the source of that wealth doesn't matter, as though there are not other forms of wealth that have to do with the time people have to spend with their families, with the health of our society and the nature of work. The idea that we can only achieve a successful, vibrant, connected, internationalist outlook by sticking with the status quo seems to me quite bizarre. And Douglas Alexander's argument that the younger generation only have something to fear from the ability to take responsibility for our own choices is a prescription for despair, I think. Instead, we should be looking at the UK, because that's the question that's very often ignored in the independence debate. We talk about Scotland. We ask ourselves about Scottish governments. What we should be asking equally is, what is the nature of the UK? What is the UK level of decision-making for? How does it function? Is it serving our needs? And if anybody listened to any of the debate from the House of Lords today about the future of Scotland, about Scottish independence, the idea that Westminster's political institutions represent a modern, connected, vibrant 21st century vision is simply laughable. The institutions of Whitehall and Westminster, I believe, are part of the problem. The barriers that people have, the barriers that we face to engaging the capacity and capability of young people in Scotland, as well as the capacity to change our economy for the better, the barriers that we face, I believe, lie first and foremost at Westminster, lie with a political culture which is beholden to the City of London and the financial institutions that it represents, which is unlikely to embrace radical change because it's composed of people principally who benefited from the status quo. The idea that we can expect change from that political level is to me bizarre. If we want to empower the young generation, if we want the network generation, the people growing up with an instinctive appetite for the capabilities of the 21st century, for what the digital age can do, can throw at us, can make of us, we absolutely need to be handing power from where it exists at the moment to people who are ready for that challenge. And I believe that there are many in the independence movement who can bring creativity to that and who can show people of my generation and older things that we can only, at the moment, begin to imagine. I said I would try and address the risks as well. I know I've been a wee bit, maybe evangelical on some points or other, but I would try and address the risks as well. There are risks if we get a yes vote. One of them, to me, is capacity in our governance. Now, that means government, civil servants, it means parliament, it means local government. There is a real risk that if we vote yes and adopt the timescale of achieving constitutional independence by March, April, May 2016, an independent government and an independent parliament in 2016, but we don't develop the capacity to actually take on those functions effectively, there is a real risk that the instinct of government will be to buy that capacity in from exactly the same consultancies who've been polluting the system south of the border. The idea that we allow KPMG to write our tax code, rather than allowing anti-poverty campaigners in Scotland to write our tax code, for example. The idea that we buy in the consultancy that has been misinforming the economic system south of the border means that we would simply end up repeating exactly the same mistakes. We'd end up with simply with an Edinburgh-based version of exactly the same problem. Now, this to me is one of the most important challenges, one of the most important problems that we will face. I think we need to be honest about that challenge and that problem. If we want to persuade people to vote for a yes vote, if I want to persuade people that independence opens up the possibilities for a better, fairer, more sustainable economy in Scotland, we absolutely need to be putting in place now the capacity to take on those functions, those responsibilities, if people choose to give them, if people choose to take them to Scotland and give them to institutions that they elect in Scotland. That's not something that I see happening yet, and it's something that I believe the Scottish Government needs to take much more account of and make sure that we don't find ourselves in a headlong rush and dependent on buying in capacity from the very same people who've been mis-selling it south of the border. So, I hope that's a reasonable canter through some of the issues, some of the fundamental challenges that not only Scotland but the world is facing. The ecological, social and economic crises which are interconnected and which we are still causing, which we are not yet solving, we are still causing and exacerbating. But the opportunity to start to do something about it, in my view, the challenges that we'll face if we take on that task, take on that historic responsibility. Facing up to challenges like this is scary. It should be scary. I think we'd be deluding ourselves if it wasn't scary. But I think there are two things you can do when you face a challenge like that. You can pull the duvet over your eyes and say, let somebody else solve it. Or you can say, yes, we're the generation who's up to that challenge. We're going to take on those challenges, meet them, and if we fail, we'll learn our own lessons. But if we can find solutions, we'll put them in place ourselves. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Would anyone like a bit of apple, by the way?
I'll have a piece, but always in for a bit of apple. That's just all right. Thank you, but do. Yeah. I'm going to take the opportunity just to probe you on a couple of points first, if I may, and then I think that I mean, yes, that was evangelical, but there's some key issues that came early on in what you were saying, which, and I think what I've heard from you and from your colleagues before, you have a very different view and vision of independence from that which comes from the SNP. You said that they had a limited vision of independence, and I think you specifically referred to the constraints, rather like Mark Carney was saying yesterday, which was saying that going into a currency union would require some compromises on sovereignty in order to achieve the agreement with the United Kingdom. And I think I take from what you're saying that you believe that that would not be feasible in order to give the scope of independence that was needed to take the radical and substantial changes that you seek. And therefore, I'm assuming that your vision would be of Scotland having its own currency and therefore having its own full responsibility for monetary, fiscal, and other elements of economic policy. Is that right?
That would be my preference, to see that come about. I wouldn't argue that the Scottish Government's proposal for some sort of shared use of the pound as our currency and of the Bank of England as our central bank, I wouldn't say that that is not feasible. And I think, much like the argument around EU membership, there are those on the No campaign who, prior to the referendum, will turn these issues into, try and portray them as insurmountable problems. If there was a yes vote, I suspect both governments would set about finding pragmatic solutions. And it might be that both governments would find that that was in their interest. Personally, I think it would involve not zero flexibility, but a lot less flexibility than I think Scotland needs in order to, to diverge our economies. Because I do want to pursue a different economic path for Scotland, one that is sustainable and more egalitarian.
Well, I think that's the point I'm trying to get to, which is that under a currency union, from reading what the governor said yesterday, I think that it is clear that there would be severe constraints on absolute fiscal policy and on elements of fiscal policy to start with, and that it wouldn't be possible to run a dramatically diverged approach as compared to the rest of the United Kingdom. That is, I suspect that what he is saying yesterday is that there would be significant constraints, and those would, I think, to me, inhibit an independent Scotland from pursuing many of the policies that you would see as desirable.
That's my view.
So therefore, the separate currency looks to me the only option that would make sense.
Yeah, and when I make that point, generally speaking, the only question the media want to ask is, what would it be called? I think that's the least important question. The question is, what's it for? What is the freedom that having your own currency would actually give to the Scottish economy? Right,
well, I just want, and then the other point I wanted to just ask you was that, I suppose the question, let me put it this way, are we ready to go down the radical route that you wish after an independent vote in September?
No, of course we're not.
Is the danger that it gets more of the same because that's the only thing we're ready for?
I would say I've been making these kind of arguments for a good number of years in elections, and there are only two of us elected. Yep. So I'm not trying to kid anyone on.
That's one more than
Scotland
Westminster.
Well, so far, yeah. I'm not trying to kid anyone on that Scotland is ready for the agenda that I'm suggesting. I do suggest that it's going to be necessary because the failure of ecological systems will become increasingly impossible to avoid or ignore. Yeah. And the impact that has on economic systems also is going to be inevitable. So all political parties and our wider society is going to have to face these kind of challenges as time goes on, whether with my prescription or with another.
Yeah. And I do have a lot of sympathy with another phrase you use, which is that we're not entering a real recovery, but a new phase of the same problem, I think I quote from you, which is the concern that with a consumer-led, debt-driven, housing market-driven recovery, it's
Absolutely.
Not quite what I envisaged was in the intention.
What
after we went into a catastrophe that was caused by excess debt, a housing boom, and too much consumption.
What we're looking at is, in my view, particularly a UK government that's not even thinking about recovery. They're looking at the reanimation of a corpse. This is a system, an economic model which is already dead, and they're simply trying to reanimate it. It has no life left to it. I think we need to bury it and look to a replacement.
So okay. I think that's helped to set some of it, and we can come back to some other issues, which is what we measure success by. If it's not by GDP, I've just had a very interesting discussion with people from the Universities Insight Institute about well-being and how we measure it.
Excellent.
And I think we have in Scotland this national performance framework, which we don't make nearly enough of, which is actually looking at a much broader set of issues.
It's stepping in the right direction.
And when we get to ecology, as chairman of the board of the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, I hear everything you're saying. I should take the apples with the chimpanzees, actually. They'd really enjoy. But let's move on to questions from the floor. There's one at the front here, and then there's one lady here. So if we start with those two questions, and if you could very kindly say who you are and any institution you want to refer to, and have some nice, brief, pointed questions.
Thank you. Owen Kelly. I'm one of the trustees of the David Hume Institute. And maybe you could call the currency the apple. That's
an idea.
My question really is about, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about why you think it's necessary for Scotland to be independent to address the sort of radical agenda that you're describing. Because, I mean, I guess it's probably an old hat thing to say, but a lot of the environmental challenges certainly are not respecters of boundaries of any kind. And one might wonder whether, you sort of ended by saying that we'd be sort of ducking a challenge if we didn't go for independence, but isn't the bigger and more perhaps real challenge to actually change the UK?
Let's take that one first, then we'll go on to the lady. No, sorry, let's just... Okay, Patrick. No, carry on to that. You answer that question. I think that's big enough to answer first.
Changing the UK would be a very limited aspiration, in my view. We need to change ourselves as a species. We need to change the way we live globally. Now, how do you set about that? You certainly need to change the way that we run our economy, and that means issues like the gap between rich and poor. How fairly is wealth distributed in our economy? There's very little that the current Scottish government, very little that local government can do at the moment around that without being able to engage in debate about tax and welfare, about the nature. Actually, we've got to re-win the argument for a welfare state from first principles because it's been lost in recent years. The right has successfully dismantled the empathy which a welfare state depends on. So I think we need to begin to engage in those debates in terms of social and economic objectives, but also the issues around how power is exercised in the economy. A great deal of power that should be democratically accountable has been handed over to the markets and to the private sector over recent decades. And the unsustainable systems that they're pursuing, the relentless promotion of consumption for its own sake, these again are things that an independent government can begin to engage with. A devolved one can't. There are things that we could do better, particularly around local government taxation powers. John Swinney could create economic powers so long as he was willing to hand them to local government. He can't exercise them from St Andrew's House, but got the ability to create the local government taxes. There's very little constraint on that. People think it's council tax or it's some replacement. Actually, you could have a wide range of local government taxation powers, and you'd have the beginnings of local economic policy, so long as a finance secretary in Edinburgh doesn't demand the right to control them all in a very centralising way. We've got incredibly centralised government in this country compared with some of those other small Northern European, Scandi-Nordic nations that we like to talk about.
Maybe I didn't, but why is the unit of Scotland the right unit?
The question is, why is the unit of Scotland the right unit? And that's your last comeback, Aaron.
I think because it's there. I think because the opportunity is there, because Scotland as a polity exists and has the will, has the motivation to begin to govern itself, at least to some extent. I think most people have the will and motivation to govern Scotland to a greater extent. I think it's the beginning of a process of decentralising, not the end of that process.
Okay, let's move to the lady here.
Elizabeth Meehan, I agree with you about the risks of continuity if we just buy in the same old institutions or institutional practices. And I think people involved in devolution, post-devolution, were very conscious of that, especially in the Parliament. But I think it's fine, we can agree about that. But and you mentioned the possibility of anti-poverty groups taking part in budgeting and taxation. But does your party have any sort of concrete ideas about how to grow that capacity between now and 2016? And if you were in government after 2016, what precisely would you do to sort of break the institutional stranglehold of the old institutions?
Well, I'll begin by mentioning again local government, which I mentioned in my last answer, because the idea not of reconfiguring and abolishing existing local authorities, constantly reconfiguring is part of the problem, but of decentralising power from existing local structures to communities. We're going to be publishing some more detailed proposals on that later in February, actually. So hopefully we'll have something of interest. But really the opportunity is there to engage far more people in decision making. Most people, quite rightly, are alienated from politics because politics has taken power from them instead of empowering people. And I think if we want to engage people, if we want people to participate, we need to give them a reason to do so. We need to give them the ability to actually make decisions about their own community, about their own street, about their own town or settlement. And there is no layer of local government in this country. There is a layer of regional service delivery, which is very, very tightly controlled from central government. There's no local government to speak of. So reimagining that and actually starting to decentralise power, bring people into the decision-making process is one of the most important things we can do. Beginning as well the process of developing a written constitution, or at least debating how we create one, I believe should happen. If there's a yes vote, it should begin more or less immediately. After both sides have had their party or licked their wounds, we need to get immediately into that discussion about what kind of constitution we want for Scotland, and to have that a participative process rather than the party politically driven one. Not wait, as the SNP is suggesting, until after 2016 before we even begin that process.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the back there, and then we'll take this gentleman here. So, yes.
Hello? Is that,
yeah.
John Tibbird. I just wanted to ask, actually connected with those last two questions, about why you feel it's independence rather than devolution that would give the opportunities, particularly to deal with issues of land distribution and the potential for a land value tax.
It doesn't. That's an example of something that we can certainly do at the moment, a land value tax, and the ability to start to address the chronically unfair distribution of land ownership in Scotland. That's certainly something that we could do right now. I think what it requires is the political will. We have the constitutional power to address that particular issue right now. We don't have the political will to do it. And I think if we... It does relate to this question about local empowerment, local decision-making. If people have the ability to make choices about the resources that their own community are dependent on, including their land, and reinforce the philosophical idea that communities do own their land, then I think that's something about reconnecting people with power.
Do you mind if I just come back very briefly with but doesn't independence actually inhibit the ability to bring in any kind of LVT, because you'll have a greater proportion of all the power that the landowners have in Scotland will be greatly increased by the fact that they are a greater proportion of a smaller nation?
They only get one vote each.
Okay. I mean, just a quick follow-up, if I may, which is, I asked Nicola Sturgeon and Joanne Lamont basically the same question. Do you believe that welfare could be effectively devolved without an independence vote? That this could be something that could be part of a Devo Max or whatever you call settlement? And would you wish that to be the case? In
principle, I guess a great deal of it could be done. Many people in the Labour Party would argue, and it's not an argument that I resent. I respect this argument, although I reach a different conclusion. Many people in the Labour Party would argue that a UK-wide welfare system is a mechanism for redistribution of wealth within the resources of the UK. And that's why many people, including many on the left of the Labour Party, don't want to devolve welfare.
But do you want to devolve it?
Well, I'll be voting yes for independence if that's off the agenda. If there was a no vote, I would still be looking to try and salvage as much of a transformational agenda as I can. And so obviously I'd be open to the possibility. I don't immediately see a mechanism for devolving as much welfare as I would like without coming up against the barrier that many in the Labour Party see about a UK-wide welfare system as being necessary for the redistribution of wealth in their terms.
But it's something you'd like to see addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be up for the debate, certainly. If there was a no vote, I'd be up for the debate about any next phase of devolution. I have to say I'm sceptical that it would be a quick debate, because I suspect if there was a no vote and then 6 months later a UK general election which is dominated by Europe and probably an incoming government, whether it's Tory or Labour, that is offering some kind of renegotiation about Europe, I suspect a lot of the UK's politicians, media, pundits, observers, commentators and electorate would turn around with a single voice and say, can you not shut up about Scotland for a while?
Yes, we've done Scotland.
You've had your referendum, you've had your devolution, you've had your Calman Bill, all this stuff. You voted no, shut up and put up with it now. And I suspect the idea of a UK government in Downing Street rather than a Scottish government in St Andrew's House that wanted to spend its political time and capital on another stage of devolution and more years of debate about what that means, I suspect that would be off the agenda for a good number of years.
I was trying to talk in principle rather than practice.
Sure.
Gentleman here.
I'm Jamie Ross. I am a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, and I also work in the Scottish Parliament for MSP.
I think I've seen you in the canteen, haven't I?
I did indeed today. Maybe it's the same tie. It's the same tie that's notified me, although I didn't have an apple. I've got two quick questions. The first one is, if there is a yes vote in 2016, what will the engagement and the participative engagement that you would envisage of young people be in that process, rather than just led by political parties or civil society groups? How are you going to engage young people in that? And the second one is, I do believe that the Greens are pragmatic people, as opposed to, very principled pragmatic people, as opposed to the SNP, who in this referendum are based on their national, they're a nationalist party. They firmly support that, whereas the Greens are in the Yes campaign and don't say, the reasons you're supporting independence are not for a nationalist purpose. So therefore, if there was a no vote, and perhaps this has been touched on by the last few points, what powers do you think are important for you to achieve this agenda that you've been speaking about in the last sort of hour? And where should they stay in the government? Should a lot of them be devolved to local level? What should come to the Scottish government, perhaps, in the Scottish Parliament?
Okay.
Well, if there was a no vote, as I say, I'm sceptical about any short-term seeding of more devolution from the UK level. But I do think that we'll still be able to make a very strong case for the devolution of existing Scottish powers to local level, not just to local government level, but down to local community level. Now, it's an argument that's been kicked around for years. No government has, yet got had the political will to do it, because very often, when you're in my position arguing from outside a government that government should give away power, that's very easy. If you actually win power, you then want to exercise it rather than give it away to somebody else. But I think the lack of connection that most people feel to decision making and to power in our society is a really chronic problem. It's going to have to be addressed. Not only the way in which power is decentralised, but the way in which we fund local services and local functions as well is going to have to be addressed, whether there's a yes or a no vote. And I think if there's a no vote, that might be one of the most important things that we can progress in the absence of additional powers for Scotland as a whole. As for young people, I would like to hope that a good, strong turnout of 16 and 17-year-olds in the referendum itself will be the beginning of a process of engaging. I mean, I've spoken to school groups. Most MSPs have. Schools are really encouragingly enthusiastic about engaging with the referendum issue, recognising that for the first time, they are now institutions that have cohorts of voters in their classrooms, and they need to engage them in a way that's imaginative, creative, without being hectoring, without promoting one side or the other. They need to be neutral but still inspiring. And I think if we can do that, if we can capture a high voting turnout of 16 and 17-year-olds, and if we can try and maintain that level of interest, there's a chance that we not only strengthen the case for votes at 16 across the board in elections as well, but actually bring up a cohort of young people who are voting at higher proportions than current 20-somethings are.
And I take it you would support permanent enfranchisement of the 16 and 17?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Question here.
You raised the question of land ownership, but there is also surely the wider question of property ownership, which may extend to people who own perhaps tracts of commercial or urban property, which are as valuable, more valuable than the land, rural land, which seems to exacerbate emotion of the worst kind and ignore what I call long-term stewardship. So that's one question. And the other is, you were disparaging about the House of Lords, in which there are people of immense capacity and knowledge of the kind some of us can only dream of. Having been disparaging of them, what better form of checks and balance would you impose in the event of independence? Because a unicameral chamber must have, or unicameral parliament, must have effective checks and balances.
I'll take the second question first, if that's all right. Yes, a democratic parliament needs checks and balances. And in many ways, the notion of parliamentary democracy, and in my view of a written constitution as well, is about controlling the power of governments, fettering the power of governments. That's really important to do. It needs to be done, though, in a way that's accountable. And it's great to have a debating chamber full of talented people, even half full of talented people. But it's essential as well that they don't just have talents and abilities, but that they have legitimacy. And that means the consent of the people. So in my view, we need, if we're talking about a second chamber, I think there are ways of sharing power between a unicameral chamber and wider civil society that don't necessarily mean a second chamber. My preference, my instinct is that the argument would be stronger for a second chamber, but it does need to be elected. Probably on a different franchise, perhaps on a Scotland-wide basis rather than a constituency basis. It needs to be elected, though, if it's going to have legitimacy. If people are going to pass laws that bind us, they need to have our consent.
So you're in favour of a second elected chamber in an independent Scotland?
It's my instinct that we would move in that direction. My personal view is if we vote for independence, we need to start building the capacity of the Scottish Parliament, because it doesn't have the capacity to hold an independent government to account.
And is it fit for purpose, given the lack of checks and balances, when you have one single party with the absolute majority?
I find the single party with an absolute majority inconvenient, but then I'm in a small opposition party. It's no less legitimate than a single party with a majority at Westminster has been. I think the processes and the systems of the Scottish Parliament, it's only, 15 years old now,
yes.
The Scottish Parliament. It was bound to be the case that we need to refresh and learn from the first few sessions. Just before the last session ended, before the last Scottish Parliament election, most of the committee conveners, for example, were starting to come to the view that we need to reinvent and refresh the committee system, the way in which parliamentary committees work, because there were lessons to learn from, and some of the imaginative, creative ideas had gone a wee bit stale. It's easy to have that view at the end of a parliamentary session. Then you go all off and fight the election. Somebody wins, somebody loses, and the winners don't necessarily want to change the system. We do need, and I think the opportunity to debate a written constitution gives us all, not just politicians and political parties, all of us, all of Scotland, the opportunity to start talking about how do we want our democracy to work.
I wasn't expecting a yes/no answer, I suppose. There's a lady over here.
Oh, there was the land question as well.
Oh, sorry, yes.
A land value tax would be based on the most beneficial, allowable use of land. And so the value of land is partly about the land itself. It's more generated by community decisions such as investment, such as planning permission. It's mostly democratic, public decisions which affect land values. And so land that's I'm afraid, for example, you guys would probably be paying a very, very high land value tax for the land that this building sits on because of where it is and because of the public investment that's gone into the area.
It's a charity, so they'd find a way around it.
Well, certainly the kind of organisations which may have their profits sent off to a tax haven cannot move land to a tax haven. And so the private sector organisations which hold very, very valuable land and at the moment pay very little in the way of tax on it would be unable to avoid tax. Land value tax is very, very hard to avoid because land is where it is.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions now. There's a lady here and then a gentleman there is asking for the mic. Let's take both together now.
Thank you. Carol Fox, amongst other things, a born-again recycler. Patrick, I'm not quite clear on your energy policy. Just back from Iceland at Christmas, we saw that they have geothermal springs that produce very cheap electricity. And Norway obviously has oil. I'm not clear from your talk what you see would underpin the economy, which would help poor people in Scotland pay for their gas and electricity bills. And secondly, while I share your vision, perhaps, to have better high streets and better shopping, that kind of 50s model was built on the kind of domestic slavery of half the female population, so I wouldn't like to go back to that. So just want you to address those two specific points.
Thank you. And the gentleman here.
Hugh Hunter-Gordon, retired and past it. 40 years ago, many of my generation bought into something which is called the Club of Rome's limits of growth. My sense of that is that it was a mirage. It didn't achieve any of the things it set out to. Therefore, I'd like to try and bring you back to your vision, because ultimately, some of the immediate practicalities you're talking about are mere endeavors as how to place yourself for the achievement of your vision. Your vision seems to be, to me, about changing ourselves to be able to cope with the limits that there are now being imposed by the planet on us. But don't you really mean changing our reproduction, reducing population till it meets the sustainable capacity of the planet? So if that is true, and I believe it to be the case, what do you see as the settled down size of the human population by 2050, when you have created a wall of immense disaster?
Okay, thank you. Okay, these are both very big questions. First of all, on energy, I think we need to be honest that energy is not a cheap commodity, and we've come through a very strange blip in human history where we were able to pretend that energy was a cheap, abundant commodity. That's not going to be the future. Energy is an expensive commodity. If we want to enable people to meet their needs, that must be at least as much emphasis on reducing the need for energy, reducing the consumption of energy, enabling people to stay warm with very low energy consumption is entirely achievable with existing technologies in building terms. We just don't use them. We're building the built environment equivalent of the 4x4. We're building gas guzzlers still. Now, at the moment, it's very hard to get house builders, for example, to adopt the kind of systems that we'd like them to reduce that energy reliance, to reduce people's reliance on large numbers of units of expensive energy. In my view, this notion of having at least a proportion of the energy industry in public or community hands, whether nationally or locally, allows you to invest some of the profits from this expensive commodity into the built environment. If Glasgow City Council was able to say, here's the investment pot that we have this year to top up what the house builders, whether that's private sector or housing associations, are putting in for new build or for retrofit. And we're then going to be the energy service company. We're going to make sure that the money you save on your bills from having a low or almost zero energy dependent home, that money is going to go back to service the borrowing that we took to invest in the first place. you could have a really different solution. You could have a solution which is not about trying to pretend we can have cheap energy, but is about trying to ensure that we can need less of it in order to meet our needs. Transport is harder. Transport energy is the harder part of the equation, I think. And again, the way in which we can reconfigure our society to have less reliance on ever greater mobility is a difficult one. And that connects with the food question as well.
And the retail question as well.
The food and retail, yeah. I mean, the local localization, the relocalization of our food system is, I believe, one that could be a great deal less dependent on exploitation, which is where your question was going, than what we have at the moment. What we have at the moment is retail giants who pay poverty wages, which are then subsidized by the taxpayer through benefits which are no longer designed as being about human well-being, a benefit system which no longer embodies the values of the welfare state. It's simply a subsidy for poverty pay. I believe that a relocalization of our food system, meeting more resources, more of our needs from local resources, not all, but a greater proportion of our food needs from local resources within communities, giving people access to land that's productive, giving people the time to use it, and the opportunity not only to be healthier through the physical exercise involved, but to know their neighbours from collaborating together to grow a larger proportion of their food. I believe this could be far more empowering and far less dependent on economic exploitation of men or of women than the Asda Walmart model that we're living with at the moment.
Quickly on to the other one, because I want to try and squeeze in two more.
Population is it's part of the problem. The size of the human population is part of the problem. There's no way of denying that. It's not the whole of the problem. It's not the whole of the problem. The way that we live, the expectations that we have for consumption is the other half of the problem. So the ecological impact of our species is about how many of us and how we live. Both of these things are interconnected. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that societies that develop well, that develop healthily, and that empower people to make choices on their own terms, and principally, if you look at around the world, that means about empowering through education and economic empowerment, women around the world. That is the thing that gives people, families, men as well as women, the ability to make real choices about how many children they wish to have. And that does not lead to population explosion. In fact, it reverses population explosion. I think if we took the view that there's a correct population size, the only thing to do about that is then to start enforcing it, imposing it on people against their will. What we should be doing is empowering people through sexual and reproductive health and rights. Rights are crucial to sexual and reproductive health, to make choices that they wish to make. And I think when we do that, that's what results in stabilized populations. We shouldn't be doing it because of the desire for stable population levels. We should be doing it because rights are a good thing in their own right, on their own terms. And the ability for the vast number of women around the world who still don't have access to sexual and reproductive health services, sexual and reproductive health rights, that's something that would be good on its own terms. I think it would also have the benefit of having population levels that are at a level that meets a community's needs as well. If we compare some of the countries that are tried the most famous country that's tried an authoritarian approach has failed completely and is abandoning it. The kind of countries that, like Thailand, for example, which had chronic poverty and a population explosion, they said, we have to do something about the population explosion because nothing we do about poverty will work if we don't do that. But they did it through empowerment. They did it through giving people the right to make choices, increasing access to sexual and reproductive health services. And by doing that, they then equipped their society culturally with the skills to talk about sex and sexuality, which were absolutely vital when HIV came on the scene as well. That's the kind of agenda that I think we should be talking about. Population health, not just population size.
Now, I want to take two more quick questions. Do we have gentleman there? Is there one other waiting? There's another gentleman there. So if we can take it right to the back. Sorry. Yes, there we are. Yes, sir.
Ronald Watt, retired economist, In terms of the referendum, how do you regard the SNP's aim to have the rate of air passenger duty?
Right, and we'll take the second one as well.
Yep.
Bill Howitt. Thanks very much, Patrick. I found that very stimulating. Agree with a lot of your analysis and very sympathetic to a lot of your conclusions. I'm a retired council chief executive, so I'm particularly sympathetic to your arguments about empowering local communities. That said, can I run past you a quick paraphrase of your talk tonight and then ask a simple question? Right, if we vote yes, we inherit what you describe as a broken system. We're not got the capacity to do very much. We're looking at anything from 5 to 20, maybe 2 generations before we can develop the kind of model that you aspire to. It's not a very pretty outcome. If we vote no, we still get the same broken system, and Westminster completely disowns us because we've had a run at it. So my question is, don't you think that having this referendum at this point in time in Scotland's history maybe isn't a very good idea?
I think it's going to go ahead. Air passenger duty first.
I'm very strongly opposed to the SNP's policy on air passenger duty and on increasing capacity in the aviation system. The UK government has a similar policy. They want to increase capacity in aviation as well. Scotland has a tourism industry which is really, really important to huge parts of rural Scotland in particular, but urban Scotland as well. If you take the view, as I do, that not only are we going to have to burn a great deal less fossil fuel, but that we're going to have to pay more for the fossil fuel that we do burn, we're going to have to become less dependent on aviation. Now, that's an economic reality, in my view. It's also a climate reality because there's very little that we can do to reduce aviation emissions unless we're willing to control aviation demand. Now, I think Scotland's tourism industry has a bright future if we can reorient it toward the domestic market, which is already substantial and has got more capacity to grow than the international market, and surface modes of transport as well. It's perfectly achievable now with even with the existing rail services, never mind tens of billions of pounds on high speed too. It's perfectly achievable to reach Scotland from other parts of Europe by rail, and we should be growing that market rather than investing money either through subsidies or through investing in expansion of capacity in aviation. Should we be having the referendum now? Well, it is a bit late to be debating that. Whether we like it or not, and some people do and some people don't in this audience, I'm sure, the Scottish people did vote in very substantial numbers for a government that was proposing a referendum at the last election. And that government was saying we will have the referendum in the second half of the Parliament, and I do think it's important that that will is enacted. I think I would like to hope that whether you're instinctively a yes or a no voter or undecided in this audience, I would like to think that the one thing that we could all agree on is this issue has been divisive and polarising in Scottish politics for decades. For decades. And it can only be resolved by the people. It can't be resolved by the political parties. It can only be resolved in a referendum. And I would like to suggest that the one outcome we should all be reluctant is a 51-49 in either direction. I would like to see a clear resolution to this question. Only a referendum can resolve it, and it's only after that, whether it's a yes or a no, that we can move on from this question. If we didn't have this referendum, it would still be hanging over us. We'd still have this polarised situation where on everything from local government taxation to minimum pricing for alcohol, you've got two big parties in Scotland that just locked horns, even when they really agree on a great deal of the centrist kind of social democratic agenda.
Patrick, thank you very much. I think that has, as Bill Howard said, been extremely stimulating and given a lot of food for thought. I said in the media release we put out now it's time for something distinctly different, and I think that is very different from the first two seminars where we had people who maybe had expectations of being the first Prime Minister in an independent Scotland, or at least being the leader of Scotland after a no vote. I think what you're talking about is having a number of critical issues that you wish to be addressed and on which you have very strong views. And you wish those addressed, whatever the constitutional context, whatever happens in many ways. You may believe that it is somewhat easier to address them in the context of an independent Scotland, but I suspect that you believe that there is a lot that could be done within the existing environment and should be done within the existing.
I think that's fair, yeah.
So I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I think we will take that away and ponder as we wait for our next seminar, which is next Tuesday, and the one after, which is the Thursday after that. So I think we've really learning a lot from this, and I'm trying to take it all away and reflect, and I hope others will. There's no transcript of Patrick's talk because he doesn't do it that way, but there will be a recording of it, which will be on our website, and there will be a write-up by one of our trustees of the key points that are put across, and I think there will be a number that are worth going back to. I should also just note for our colleague over there that the Club of Rome still exists, and we had the General Secretary of the Club of Rome speaking here last autumn, and they're still saying some very interesting things with a lot of empathy, I think, between what they're saying and Patrick's saying.
And I would suggest as well that modern computer modelling, which they never had access to at the time, has actually validated some of the core conclusions, even if the timescales were not correct at the time. I think the fundamental idea of limits to growth may have become unfashionable for a time, but it's never gone away.
And there's another volume out now. Enough of that wasting 40 years. We're wasting drinking time. I'd invite you all to join us for a glass of wine. But first of all, I'd like to thank the Young Academy and our 4 supporters of this, but most of all, I'd like to ask you to thank Patrick Harvie for a very stimulating hour and a half. Thank you, Patrick.